All right, so I'll get started. So this is our second community call, and the Webrecorder project is again sort of our motto is web archiving for all. And what that means is basically building tools uh, for anyone to use to create web archives on their own computer and to share them and host them as they choose. And so I'll briefly cover some of the updates to the tools that we're building. And there actually recently have been some some new tools that we've released, and they kind of update to older tools. And I just kind of wanted to cover that briefly. So previously we had Webrecorder Player, and kind of the new replacement for Webrecorder Player is the Replayweb.page system, which is both a website and a desktop app. And so if you're currently using Webrecorder Player, you should switch to the new Replayweb.page app. And the app is available for download from GitHub. And actually, you could also just use Replayweb.page itself as a website. So you can just go to the site, Replayweb.page, and that allows you to load WARC files and also the new WACZ files that we're developing directly in your browser. And so the idea with this new system is that it runs entirely in the browser. It doesn't have any kind of external dependencies. So the entire archive loads in the browser. And then more recently, just announced, I think last community call, we have the Archiveweb.page system, which builds on the Replayweb.page system, which is for replay, and that is available as both a Chrome extension and a desktop app. And so that is actually replacing the current Webrecorder desktop system. So if you're using Webrecorder desktop, the recommended path is to migrate to the Chrome extension or the just recently released desktop app. And finally, Browsertrix, which has been our kind of automated crawling system. Initially, it was called just Browsertrix, and it was an all-in-one system. Now we've kind of refactored that into Browsertrix-Crawler, which is kind of a much slimmer, simpler crawl-only component. And I'll actually start with that. And Browsertrix-Crawler, basically, it is entirely, so it's basically a Docker container. And the idea is that you can just run it on a command line, run one command, and it starts a crawl, and out comes WARC files or WACZ files. And the idea is that the system can be really easily customized. So we'll have, it's basically customizable with JavaScript and behavior driven. And so far we have support for, so what it can do so far is autoplay videos, it can auto scroll page, and it could automatically fetch certain URLs that are not automatically loaded in the browser. So it can load, for example, multiple resolutions of images and so forth. Yeah, that's basically the idea, is that it's just one Docker image that that basically produces a crawl of a single site, and we're working on expanding that to support additional crawling options. And this example here, for example, is sort of a very simple one way that you might run it is just like this, and it'll run 3 workers on this one site, and it'll generate a WACZ file, and then that'll basically just start a crawl. And actually, one use case of this that I want to highlight is a service called YouZim.it, which is operated by Kiwix.org, which is a nonprofit. Initially focused on creating archives of Wikipedia. I think that's sort of where they started from, is archiving Wikipedia and basically creating archives for offline use. And they actually helps basically they helped sponsor the development of Browsertrix-Crawler, and they're actually using it in production as part of YouZim.it. And so you can actually try this out. It's a free service. It's also fully open source, and basically it uses Browsertrix-Crawler underneath, and it produces files in a format called Zim, which is WACZ's format, and it works with their viewers. And they have viewers for various platforms, including mobile and desktop and so forth. And this is kind of still in development, but they're basically operating this free service. So if you want to try it out, it's so part of the development of Browsertrix-Crawler was to support this service, and we're expanding it to support many other use cases. And then I also wanted to talk about kind of moving on to Archiveweb.page. So Archiveweb.page replaces the desktop app, and part of the reason for that is that the Webrecorder desktop app, the way it was designed, it sort of required running Python and Redis as part of the app itself, and so it bundled all these other applications, and that caused issues on the latest versions of macOS and Windows, and that is no longer an issue with the latest Archiveweb.page, since everything is implemented essentially in JavaScript, and it runs, that allows it to run both in the browser and entirely in the Electron app. And so you can actually also, easy to remember, you can go to Archiveweb.page, and from there you could either install the extension or, as of yesterday, download the new desktop app, which is in beta. And really, I would say the extension probably is recommended for most use cases, since it works with your existing browser profile. So if you're already logged into certain sites, the extension will allow you to archive those sites essentially without having to relog in, whereas the desktop app, you would need to relog in again. However, if there are certain sites where the extension isn't working, or if you just prefer using a desktop app, we wanted to also offer the desktop app kind of to essentially for those that want to migrate from the previous Webrecorder desktop app. And this is sort of the kind of classic Webrecorder approach of record what you browse. So as you're browsing, it's one page at a time, and you can choose exactly what to archive. And Archiveweb.page produces WARC files and WACZ files interactively, so it's very much user directed. And finally, I want to cover is the Replayweb.page system, which replaces Webrecorder Player. So that was actually announced in the middle of last year, and basically Replayweb.page supports replaying WARC files and WACZ files from ideally from any system, so from Browsertrix-Crawler, from Archiveweb.page, as well as from Conifer, from Heritrix, from wherever you might have WARC files. They should ideally work in Replayweb.page. And it can also be used to view web archives entirely offline using the app, and actually even using the site itself. It should automatically, you can install it as a progressive web app, which allows it to run offline. And you could also embed Replayweb.page into other sites. And yeah, that's sort of the idea. And so wanted to, so kind of what are some of the recent challenges and work ahead. So recently, YouTube has changed how the YouTube player works, and so that required a lot of changes actually to make YouTube archivable again. And also I've been working a bit on capturing and replaying complex COVID dashboards. And actually I wanted to kind of show one particular use case of that, and this has been a collaboration with Dr. Sean Walker at University of Arizona. And so I've been trying to archive this dashboard here, and I'll just use the extension, and so I'll kind of show kind of So I'll create new. And so the extension is kind of, you can see here that it's sort of, as it's going, it's capturing, this is already what has been captured and recorded. And this is actually a fairly complex site. And unfortunately, all these dashboards require a lot of interaction. So this one page, for example, has a drop down, and I have to change this drop down to archive this content. Then each of these is also actually loads a new iframe. And so right now, in order to archive this fully, basically I'm manually clicking on each of these icons here, and you can actually see the extension as I click on a new icon here. This size counter is going up because it's loading more stuff, and so right now this is kind of the way that we're able to archive this is kind of very manually. And then this other tab, for example, actually opens a whole ArcGIS embed here, and so basically I would have to go through and kind of archive all of these. And this is actually quite tricky because all of the data is loaded dynamically, and initially it turned out that the order that you click on these also matters, as it makes a different type of request. So there's basically, it keeps track of which order you click on these, and that makes it even more difficult to archive and replay. And there's like multiple tabs, and so far it seems to be working. So and this is using Tableau, so I'm hoping that progress on this system will allow for archiving other COVID dashboards that also use Tableau. And because this is, I mean, I think no sort of just trying to crawl it naively with a crawler would not get much of this content, unfortunately. And so, kind of in the interest of time, so I'll view this recorded page, and so, oh well, maybe that didn't work. That was just, oh, here we go. Okay, so you can see how tricky this still is, even after spending some time on this. The replay is not perfect, and so I can click on this. Hopefully, this will load. And again, I have to, even to check this replay, I have to click on each of the tabs, and yeah, so that's kind of definitely been an interesting challenge, archiving these. And so right now this has been done manually. We're hoping that as we figure out how to do this manually, we'll be able to create a customized behavior in Browsertrix-Crawler that can automate clicking on these. And so that's basically been the approach, is to first try it manually in the extension and then figure out where what things can be automated. And hopefully we'll be able to automate most of this, but we'll see. Yeah, and so I'll stop this. And so going back to the slide, so some of the other ongoing work is basically supporting import of WARCs and WACZ files into the extension and app. So right now it doesn't yet have import, only Replayweb.page does. One of the next things is to add the ability to import existing archives so that you could add to them. And site-specific behaviors, including such as support for dashboards. That's obviously a critical thing. we'll be working on, and more documentation, and also syncing up the replay between Replayweb.page and PyWB, since they're slightly different right now, and figuring out a way to make them more aligned. Oh, and maybe very briefly, I'll also show the Archiveweb.page app, which is, so it basically looks just like the extension. That's sort of the idea, that it's that it has basically the same UI. And so I'll create here, and then maybe we'll archive this YouTube video, which is a YouTube video about archiving YouTube, so it's a little bit meta. And so I'll enter that here, and it opens. So in the desktop app, it's the idea is to keep it basically the same UI as much as possible, and basically it has a little basically the same kind of icon here and drop down menu, and yeah, basically the idea is to kind of show the same progress that you see in the extension, and then you can basically view the archive in a separate window. Yeah, and so that's the beta of the Archiveweb.page app, and the idea is that we'll try to keep them in sync, so that new features added to the app and the extension will be released at the same time. And finally, I want to kind of answer a question that I think came up in some of the responses that we got, is sort of what can you do with WARC and WACZ files once you created them with the extension or with the app or Browsertrix. And we can delve into this more a bit next time even, but I just wanted to cover some of the options, which includes uploading to Google Drive. So you could actually load web archives directly from Google Drive. With the Google Drive integration, you could host them on cloud storage, AWS, DigitalOcean, and you could also even host them on IPFS, which is a bit experimental. And you can also finally just store them locally and offline. And you can embed Replayweb.page into any other sites, potentially with other CMSs. That's definitely something that we're interested in. And of course, you could also finally host a more traditional Wayback Machine with PyWB. And so there's a number of different options, and what we definitely like to hear more about is sort of what makes sense for you, like what are the different use cases, because the idea is to make it possible to store web archives wherever you're storing other data. So it doesn't have to be all in one place, all in this special web archive only storage, but really integrated with existing archival systems. And that's kind of what we're trying to figure out, what those systems are and where that integration can make sense. Emma will kind of talk about the WACZ format, which is sort of our sort of what we're trying to do to make web archives easier to work with as a kind of standalone objects.
Yeah. So sorry, I'm running a Browsertrix-Crawler because I'm also trying to archive the website. So WACZ is basically a zipped up file that contains your WARCs and everything that you would need to host a web archive, ideally a smaller web archive. So I ran the Browsertrix-Crawler on example.org, or I think example.com, which is basically just one page to get this really simple demo WACZ file. Can you see my terminal?
Yes.
Okay.
And you could even show Browsertrix-Crawler running in your terminal if you want.
Yeah, here's what it looks like when it's running. I've given it 8 workers, and I've given it. I'm doing a favor for one of my old professors, and I'm trying to help her archive the David Wojnarowicz artist archive base that she's working on, which is very big. There's like 618 relevant HTML pages, and for some reason Google refuses to index it. For months and months we couldn't figure out why. We got it to index like 100 of the pages, and if you can't index it and you're not running off Wikimedia like she's not, then it's really hard to create search inside this really complex archive. So my solution was, okay, let's make a WACZ file, because then we can get this full text pages.jsonl file and we can just search through that really quickly. Because for anybody who's familiar with David Wojnarowicz, he has a lot of works that have a lot of really complicated interplane elements. So it's pretty critical for the archive that hosts his works to be able to do a complex search. And Google custom search engine just wasn't working for that use case. So this is what it looks like when it's running. You sort of see, your CPU load. This has an estimated 32 minutes left because there's a lot of pages. So I'm just going to leave that in the background and unzip a much simpler WACZ file, which I've called demo. So you can unzip it on the command lines where you just say unzip. You can also just use any zip tool that you would normally use. And this will create this in my downloads folder. So this is the original file. And when I unzip it, I get a JSON file called data package and 3 folders. I get indexes, an archive, and pages. And if I look a little bit deeper into these, the indexes pulls up an index.cdx file, which you were probably familiar with. The archive contains the WARCs of what I actually was using. There's a text work and a data work, I think because I downloaded this from the Chrome extension. And you get a pages.jsonl file. And the pages.jsonl file is kind of what I was talking about, the reason I was making this walkthrough for my professor. You can enable full text index, which would pull basically all of the text present on a page. So all you'll see if you're doing a really basic crawl is the title of the page, the URL, a unique ID that we randomly give it, the size, a timestamp, and then the text present on the page. So this is, the sort of lorem ipsum that was on this example domain. But this is really useful if you're trying to run a text search in your archive. And the data package.json is basically just a metadata file. It holds hashes for all of the elements in here. So if you ever want to do a fixity check, it will show you the hash using either SHA-256 or MD5, depending on what you've specified, because we allow both. And it's just designed to help you sort of keep track of what you're storing and how well it's doing, basically. It's compliant with the frictionless standard, if you're familiar with that at all. But the relevant part for most people, I think, is that it has the hashes and the byte size of the files stored in there.
Great, thanks, Emma. Yeah, and basically, yeah, so this is a format that we have the spec for this on GitHub, and we have a Python library for creating the WACZ file. And basically what it does is it takes existing work files and packages them up. So if you're concerned about not having the work file, that's not an issue because the work is basically inside the WACZ file. So you can always get data back out if you need to. Yeah, and then that's kind of the other part of it is that yeah, it makes it possible to read web archives. It makes it possible to read large web archives on demand without having to download the entire work file, which, for example, if you have a 10 gigabyte work file, in order to load it in Replayweb.page, the entire file has to be loaded. But with the WACZ format, there's a way, because the index is also packaged in there, we can actually load everything on demand and only load the pages or the resources that are needed.
Yeah, that's super useful.
Yeah, so I think we wanted to leave the rest of the time for kind of for questions and kind of see where folks are at, what tools you're using, what issues you're having, what you would like to see more of, what you'd like to see less of. Yeah, how can we help make web archives easier for you?
So, question about the resulting works from Archiveweb.page. We used Archiveweb.page to crawl a few Twitter pages on the quick. The results looked really good in Replayweb.page, but at the Library of Congress, need to index the works so they can be accessed through our own on-site systems. So right now we have CDX indexes and Open Wayback. So we went to do the indexing and it didn't really work. I used VI to look into the WARC and it seems to be different from other WARCs. We couldn't find any resource metadata and it looked like the contents were all binary. So we were wondering, is there something different about WARCs from Archive.page from standard WARCs, and how do we access the resource metadata?
So the works, ideally, I hope they're not any different, but work is sort of a very low level format in the sense that it just basically has it's just a HTTP requests and responses, and in order for it to actually play back, right now it works in Replayweb.page, and they should also work in PyWB, and we're trying to make sure that those are in sync. They will not work in Open Wayback, unfortunately. And I think, as far as I know, the Library of Congress is working on migrating to PyWB. So I think that should help with the replay. I think that there should be a pretty significant improvements once that's in place. And if not, then we can probably hopefully figure out what the discrepancies are. Twitter is also particularly difficult because of how it's all API driven now, and so multiple captures of the same page in Twitter may not necessarily render correctly, and but yeah, so it's a little bit tricky with Twitter especially, but hopefully, hopefully the migration to PyWB will help.
So the question was, I'm not completely clear of the benefits differences of WACZ over WARC. So my sort of little helpful metaphor is that WACZ file is sort of like a helpful little backpack where you put a WARC in it, but you also get this other stuff. So you also get the benefit of a full text like indexable search of the pages.jsnl file. You also get a frictionless data compliant file that has the hashes and some other metadata about when all of this stuff was collected. And you get the original WARC as well as the index.cdx file generated for you. So it's sort of just like the original WARC that you want, plus all of this other helpful stuff that has sort of everything you would need to host a mini web archive. Okay, yeah, it's a helpful little backpack full of the original and then a bunch of bonus stuff that makes it easy for you to host your own web archive.
Is the WARC extractable?
Yeah, so if you, let me share my screen again real quick. Like when I unzipped the WACZ file, the original WARC is in the archive folder. So you get those 3 folders, you get this index generated automatically for you in the indexes folder, and you can get either an IDX or a CDX. The default is a CDX. You get the full text in the pages, and then you get the original WARC file in the archive folder. So the way that you make a WACZ file, well, there's a couple of ways that you can make a WACZ file across our tools, but one of the ways is you can just pass the WACZ package a WARC file, and it will package it up for you in this neat little format. So the WARC file is always accessible in the archive folder.
Yep, and also, if you download from the extension, there's basically, it just creates 2 files, data.warc, which is everything, and then text.warc, which is sort of also duplicated in the pages.jsnl, but basically it's a WARC file of just the full text data. And I think that was basically because we weren't sure if how we're going to store it in the WACZ yet, but if you also want the full text data in WARC files, that's also available.
Yeah, and the way that I use the tools personally is if I have something that's really big and complicated, I'll run a Browsertrix-Crawl of it because it's much easier than me manually visit. Like the archive I'm running in the background right now is like 618 pages. And it's much easier to have something just detect those pages for me. And if it's something smaller, like the example.org page, which was 1 page, I just did it on the browser extension because it's really quick. You can just download it in a WACZ file directly from your browser. And I was able to do that like 2 seconds before we hopped on this call.
Another question relating to WACZ is, how well would that scale up? Thank you, Nicola.
Hi. So thanks. Thanks, Emma. That was a really good good description. Sorry, my question that I put in the chat is a bit random because it's out of context. It was related to when you were describing how WARC files would give you everything that you need to create a mini web archive. But I'm thinking that it's going to scale up to a certain extent, but you're not going to be able to kind of process hundreds and hundreds of WARC files, I guess, this way, or would you be able to?
I think that, yes, that's definitely a good question. So far, the largest WACZ file that we've had is 17 gigabytes. I think is as far as I've tested. So they're more designed for kind of basically maybe one or two specific sites that may be hosted individually. And so I'll give an example of this. So for example,
it's basically like you could scale it up, but you're not really intended to past a certain.
Yeah, I mean, it should definitely scale to at least I would say hundreds of gigabytes. I feel confident to say that it would scale to that. As far as terabytes and petabytes, probably not, because you probably don't want to anything at that size you don't want to have in a single file. So for example, and this is probably kind of the most complete example that we have so far, is I'll share this link, and this was a collaboration with Stanford University Press to archive 6 of their publications. And so if you go to the site, and maybe I'll do maybe I'll just do a screen share. So I shared the link here, and so basically, and this is kind of what you can do with Replayweb.page and WACZ files, is that basically each of these sites here is loaded. So basically, this is just a kind of a very simple custom site, and it embeds Replayweb.page inside of it, and basically, so this is actually I think this particular site is I believe 17 gigabytes, and so it has about 200 Vimeo videos, and so I can it was actually already cached in my browser because I loaded before, but if it's loading from scratch, it should load pretty quickly because it is it's able to load everything on demand. And so that's sort of what the WACZ format is designed, is to support kind of a single, mostly essentially an archive of a, let's say, a single site with maybe several pages in it. Although of course, it's still very new, and so it can be used for potentially larger projects as well. And so in this case, we just have one page, and so like the metadata for this page is also in here. There should also be full text search, so I can actually do a search on this, and it's basically, and so all of that data is read from the WACZ file, and just to show you kind of like what that looks like in the so there's actually a little bit of there's basically just this this whole archival embed is added to the page with a single HTML tag like this, and that's sort of the idea. So like everything is read from this one WACZ file in this case, and so the idea with this is that it should make it possible to store web archives into existing systems that already store other types of files. So ideally, this could work with institutional repositories or content management systems that aren't designed for web archives, but can basically provide simple file storage and make it possible to integrate web archives into those systems. So it's a little bit, yeah, that's sort of the main use case for this. Of course, if you already have a large web archive, such as for example, the UK Web Archive or other national libraries, then then the WACZ format is probably not necessary for that use case. But this is more like for smaller scale standalone web archives. But ideally, the replay fidelity can be the same. Does that kind of answer a question?
Yes, thank you. That's great. Thank you. I guess that's a challenge, Ilya, there, isn't it, for somebody to use this to find the boundaries of how far it's going to scale up. So I guess as the community starts to use it a bit more, you'll get a bit of feedback on that.
Yes, and I'm hoping that it can scale to definitely, let's say, up to 1 terabyte. So we'll see. That's definitely my goal to be able to at least support that.
Thank you.
Okay, some more questions that we'll do 3 in a row from Zephy because I was waiting till WACZ was done.
Okay, sure.
So first, I'm wondering how Archiveweb.page / Conifer does with Google Maps. I attended to capture an embedded map, but also the actual URL of a specific pin on the map, and none of them seemed to render when I replayed it in the WARC. Is it that Google Maps might be too porky?
Well, that's I know at some point Google Maps worked pretty well, but that was about a year ago, at least, since I last tested it, I think. I think Archiveweb.page would definitely be the latest. So if it doesn't work in Archiveweb.page, then it probably doesn't work in Conifer either, since that's running a slightly older version of the archiving stack. Yeah, it's just something that would have to be tested, I think. So we can test that and get back to you for next time. Hopefully it is fixable. Yeah, and of course Google Maps also has lots of there's the plain map, there's also overlays, and so depending on how much of that, yeah, I think that could be perhaps a whole nother project similar to, like, recently I was focusing on the COVID dashboards. That may be another kind of a fidelity dive in that needs to happen.
Does integrating Replayweb.page onto a page also include the full text functionality already, or is this something to be implemented separately?
Yes. So especially if you're using if you're embedding Replayweb.page with a WACZ file, it should also include the full text, especially if you create it from. So it depends on where, and we can probably create more documentation explanation on this. But basically, if you're using Archiveweb.page to create and download the WACZ file, the full text should be there automatically. That's part of the archiving process. If you're converting older WARC files into WACZ, such as using the Python WACZ tool, then there's an option to extract the text as you go along. And of course, if you're just using Replayweb.page with WARC files without converting them to WACZ, then you won't get the full text. So that's kind of a, yeah. So the ideal is or sort of the simplest way is if you create a new archive using the extension, then you should have full text search.
Perfect. And from Jasmine, can you give an example of a situation where the browser extension would be preferable to the desktop app and vice versa?
Yes, that's definitely a good question. I would say that I think, and we'll try to create more of these examples since the app is still new, but I would say I would use the extension first, and if it doesn't work, such as, for example, on certain types of pages with certain types of iframes, Chrome has like a security, like it blocks you from archiving those, and then you'll see an error message, and if you see that, then probably trying it in the app next would be the best option. So I think ideally it should, yeah, I would definitely start with the extension, but because the browser is a bit more, for example, like, for example, I know that Google Docs, it's not possible to archive, I believe, in the extension because I think Google has some restriction, or not intentionally, they say, but there's the apps that are installed that make it harder to archive certain Google sites in the extension, but those should work in the app. However, the app is still a beta, so it may not, like, I've noticed that it earlier today crashed on a site that I was trying to archive. So hopefully that'll be fixed soon. But the app is also good if you want to if you want to share things with IPFS, which is kind of an experimental feature that doesn't work so well in the browser, fortunately. But if you use the app and then you create an archive that you want to send to someone, it should load much better. So yeah, I mean, I think I would use the extension first, but it sort of also depends on your preference. And eventually we'll write all this up and add it to the user guide.
I also, me personally, when I do web archiving and use an extension, is something that if it looks complicated, I kind of capture and then do some quality control so I can like engage and see how the web page is acting, just because I'll be able to specifically pinpoint on, like, I know this page was troublesome, and then kind of look at that network preferences and look at that source code, and I would know which page because I was using an extension, so that means I was clicking on everything. So it's like doing two in one in a process.
Yeah, and hopefully the extension is, I think it's maybe a little bit easier to use because it's already integrated into your browsers, whereas the app you have to open kind of a separate app to use, or maybe you prefer that. So I mean, there's mostly it's for the app was created one for issues where the extension doesn't work. We didn't want to be limited by kind of security restrictions that are in Chrome, and to maintain continuity for those that are already using the Webrecorder desktop app. If you already have an established workflow with an app, you can basically adapt that to the new app.
From Amy, can any of these tools replay ARC files, ARC?
Unfortunately, no. Mostly it's so for those that aren't familiar with it, ARC is a even older format that predates WARC. I think some institutions may still have ARC files that have been doing archiving for a long time. I think it hasn't been in, well, I shouldn't say that for sure, but I believe it has not been in production use for some time by most archiving institutions. And basically the only tool that we have that can play ARC files right now is PyWB. However, if that it's not hard to convert ARC files to, and essentially either convert them to work on the fly, or even to WACZ and kind of package them up as well. Yeah, mostly it's just that there hasn't been any specific use cases for replaying ARC files recently for us, but it's definitely something that could be supported if necessary.
From Ricardo, I recorded a Facebook page, extracted the work, but I could not replay completely the page, namely when I tried to scroll down.
Yeah, so Facebook remains one of the biggest challenges always. So if you're, I believe I've tested Facebook with the Archiveweb.page extension a few weeks ago. I think depending on the type of, I know that it worked. I think on it's definitely harder on like a Facebook timeline, but I think for for example, a videos page, it worked reasonably well. However, it's still, I mean, Facebook is constantly changing things. So if it worked 2 weeks ago, I wouldn't be surprised if it stopped working now, unfortunately. But if you have a specific example, I could probably take a look at that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, unfortunately, Facebook remains a challenge. And I mean, I think, but it may be working better with, yeah, I mean, hopefully we can make some things to make it work better in the future, but no guarantees, unfortunately.
So one difficulty we found when trying to archive embedded YouTube videos was that because of the way YouTube feeds the videos in the websites, Webrecorder has difficulty interpreting what it has crawled. So instead of having a nice MP4, we have a series of fuzzy YouTube URLs.
So this was just today, and I know Ilya, you mentioned just earlier in the call that again with YouTube, it's always one step ahead of us. It's always changing the way it delivers content. So you know, as much as we can engineer for YouTube on or any other embedded content on one day, the next day they'll change how they deliver the content, and so we're back to square one. But it was just something that we noticed today was I'd used the Chrome extension and I'd managed to get embedded YouTube videos and they were playing back. But when I looked at the information, the logs in Webrecorder, it was difficult for Webrecorder to understand what it had got. So, you know, instead of having a nice sort of 200 status code, here's an MP4, there were all these fuzzy YouTube URLs, really, really long URLs. And we think that perhaps we've captured portions of each video, but that Webrecorder hasn't quite been able to interpret what it's got because of all the obfuscation of what YouTube does with URLs when you play a video back.
That's possible. I think that there's actually a lot of work being done to make sure that it does get the MP4, because sort of the default YouTube, if you just load a YouTube video in the browser, what it does is it basically splits up the video into small chunks, and it serves the next chunk based on your bandwidth. And so it's very difficult to actually even have it basically to be able to reproduce that. Fortunately, there is a way to kind of trick YouTube into serving an MP4, and that basically requires changing the JavaScript on a YouTube page, and changing that JavaScript also needs to keep up with the changes to YouTube. So it's quite possible that like you said, YouTube is one step ahead of us, and they've changed something, and Webrecorder hasn't quite caught up to that. So if you have an example of that, definitely send it, and hopefully it's an easy fix. I believe so. I just tested this YouTube video. Maybe just real quick, I'll kind of I'll share my screen, and so I was recording this YouTube video, and we can actually in the playback portion, we can actually search for, so in this case it did, luckily it did in this case, because it was just a single YouTube page, get a video that looks like this, which I think is a video MP4, and it will always be a long URL that has video playback, and so you can just load that video like this. But if it doesn't do that, yeah, so one way to tell is to basically just go into the audio video filter in Archiveweb.page and kind of see what you have. And so if it doesn't have something like this, then maybe it didn't work, and we need to make some changes. And hopefully it's just a simple fix to kind of keep up with YouTube.
The last question from Anissa, just to say how useful it would be if we could discuss more / access a tutorial for hosting archives in the cloud. I recently asked a question about this in our forum. Thank you. And Rafael kindly shared an adjustment, but unfortunately, I'm still not able to load/access the file via Replayweb.page. Video.
Thanks for reminding us, Anissa. Yes, in fact, that's something that we were actually considering covering in a perhaps in the next call, as to how to host web archives on your own more easily. And so we'll definitely, we'll definitely try to provide some examples and to make that easier. So that'll be a great topic for the next call, and also based on the kind of the results of the survey. So we'll definitely, you'll hear more from us on that soon.
Yeah, next call will most likely be themed storage and CMS. So thank you so much, and we won't keep you any further. So enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.